All right, who's ready to go on a tour around the country? Most of this data I presented to my students yesterday. Then I asked them what looked important to them. And I asked them if they really wanted to, could you make a graph for me? And so that's what I had them do. And I'm happy to say that several students had points that I wanted to get into this to give them, pass them on to you. So the data that I gave them was surveying maybe 24 schools across the country, saying what happened when universities reopened. Many semester schools started in August, so here we are in mid-September, and now what can we learn from what they've done? Some of them have been in session for more than a month. Well, number one, I said they're in session. Well, it has to be qualified a little bit, because some of them have taken what's called a pause or a toggle. Okay, many West Coast schools aren't opening at all, or UW and University of Oregon, as far as I know, are on quarters. We are on quarters too, but we shifted our quarter to start September 14 so that we'd be done before Thanksgiving. Really smart move in my opinion. So now can we look around and can we look at these other experiments? And I only say, it sounds like I'm being disparaging when I'm saying experiments, or maybe callous or something like that. But no, I mean to be that we're approaching all of life as an experiment. It's an experiment that you have to take great care with. But these experiments of reopening are allowing the college students to move toward their life's calling. And that's why I think they're important. This is the assignment I gave to my students. I showed them a lot of data. I wanted them to write me a short summary of what was important to them. And I took this from this. All of the students either, they said, they didn't say I couldn't use their name, and I asked them to say if they couldn't. So I'm going to use their name. I will delete it later if it turns out this is not the case. One of the headlines that happened as classes opened at UT Austin was this: a complete fantasy. You know, college students don't know either, so they were all making contingency plans. That's very smart. But I also wonder if this headline is a little bit tilted to making us feel like it's hopeless. You know, why should we do this? Well, that was August 26th. We now have different headlines. And I was thinking about how would I write the headline. It's a really hard thing to try to think about, how you sum it up. And I actually like this Washington Post headline: upheaval, pandemic weirdness, and a fragile stability. That's the most important thing I want to say. We've achieved, in most cases, a fragile stability so far on college campuses. The Washington Post article describes 3 big schools still open, including ASU and Duke, 1 big school on a pause, and 1 small school that sent most of its students home. I'm going to go through this data real fast just so you can see it if you're interested in one of these schools. And I'm also going to mention my students noticing. Now, the other thing is, in August, I can understand titling a video as saying it's a ticking time bomb. In mid-September, when many schools have been in session for a number of weeks, some have toggled a pause, but some have not. I think that's a little inflammatory to have on a video. I want to say that the headline of the article is much better, in my opinion. There are schools that have toggled to online-only instruction. UNC Chapel Hill and Washington State University have sent most of the undergrads home, those who have the ability to go somewhere else. Those who have no place else to go are still on campus. That's a very few number. That was true even in the spring for us. So there were temporary toggles at Notre Dame, at Urbana, at Madison, at U of Arizona, and UC Boulder. Arizona and Boulder just started. Madison and Urbana are over or almost over, and Notre Dame was the first one. So I want to start with them. There's also something I find is really cool. PCR is the method that we use to detect the virus. It is so sensitive, it can actually detect virus in wastewater. It's not an easy thing to do, and it's got a high degree of uncertainty. But it can be done. It's being done at these 4 schools, although the bottom 2 are not reporting the data I can find, and so I'm going to show you that data from University of Georgia and Arizona State University. Okay. There also is University of Illinois Urbana put a lot of effort into the chemistry professors coming up with a saliva testing program so they could do way more tests than anyone else and screen everyone like a couple times a week. And so of all these schools, one of my students, Victor, made this graph where cases tended to peak a week after classes start. He looked at 7 different universities, and most of them, you see that this you get case peaks around day 7. It's a little bit weird because some schools, they don't report the data the same way. The good news with this is in all of these cases, we have been able to see a decrease happen that in every case, I believe, is a true decrease and not just a reporting lag. These happened a number of weeks ago in many cases. And so you see that you do have a peak that happens after classes open, and it's pretty consistent that the peak happens about 7 days after classes open, with one exception out of 7. It's that kind of thing. So what happened with Notre Dame? They had 2 weeks of class, then they put everyone on pause for 2 weeks and said, we're going to do our classes all online. Then they returned to in-class instruction on September 7th. Here's their dashboard, and I looked at it and noticed that on 9/18 there were 3 cases reported. On 9/20 there were 0 cases reported. That's pretty good. If we zoom in and we point out those 3 dates on their case graph, you can see they had 1 day with cases above 100. First day, it came a week after the first day. Then they went on pause after a week of high cases. But then the cases went down, they resumed, and the cases have not significantly gone back up. This is the best success story, actually, because they've been doing this since August 10th, I believe it is. 2 of my students, Hannah and David, they noticed that Notre Dame is actually not that big of a university. I thought Notre Dame was going to be like a 30,000, a 40,000 student university. But, and I've been on campus, it's really big. So it fooled me. Now they might have a lot of graduate programs, but undergraduate programs are only 8,000, 9,000 students. That means that these numbers are worse than I thought they were. And when you add them all up, about 7% of the student body has tested positive for COVID-19. This actually compares pretty well to the model C19 Pro's estimate that 11.5% of the Indiana population is infected. So it looks like the students were sampled from Indiana. Now the students were really sampled from across the nation. But this is not that far off from what you would expect if the C19 Pro model is right on. Right the next state over, Illinois State University. They opened a bit later. Their first day was in mid-August, and they had really high numbers. And on 8/29, they had really high numbers, but then it came back down. And I've been looking for evidence. I don't believe that they did a major lockdown type of situation. I don't think they toggled. I don't think they paused. And so what you have right here is you have a case where it looks like cases peaked a little bit later, but then the cases came back down. And in the past couple weeks, the cases are nice and low. So one of my students, Matthew, noticed this, and he went and he compared Notre Dame's numbers to Illinois State's. And he noticed that Notre Dame's numbers are a little bit better if you look at positive percent rate, and again, this assumes a lot of things. Notre Dame's are a little bit better if you divide up the time into blocks of time, like pre-pause, pause, and after pause for Notre Dame. And if you do it, it looks like the pause got you something, but Illinois State University, without a pause, did see the line go down, and they actually have a pretty low positive percentage right now. Interesting observation from Matthew. And so here's Urbana's. Urbana is a big school, and they have that self-designed saliva testing program. Classes started August 24, and despite the saliva testing, they still had to lock down September 4th for 2 weeks. Here's the data showing the 2 dates when classes started. Cases go up. Now these cases are higher because they're running a lot more tests. Notice their positivity number is still down below 3, but it went up. They decided that was too much for them. They went on pause, and it went down. And now they're preparing to reopen again. Given Notre Dame's experience, it's looking like I'm predicting that they'll be okay. This also goes with the county level data, where they define not by a saliva test that's widely administered, but they define by onset of symptoms, which is sort of the other end of the definition. And you notice that they locked down, they had 1,000 cases with symptoms in the county. I really wonder if the saliva testing did anything extra for them from the other universities that we're seeing. UW-Madison is, let's move up in the country to UW-Madison. They had a September 2 start, and their pause was in early September. It must have been after a week at most. And they're going to resume September 21. There is a public feud. They follow the same pattern. Cases go up, cases go down. They had a lot of positive tests in a single day on September 9th, more than 200. And so the cases have gone down since, and it looks like they're ready to test this hypothesis again. And I mentioned this specifically because in the news, the UW chancellor is wanting them to open, follow their plan. The county is saying, I don't know why you don't just send everyone home. Well, I have to take the chancellor's side on this, because we've seen all these other schools that so far are doing okay, even without some kind of pause. Here's a zoom in on this, and you can see that cases were well above 200 on one day. It seems like for a big school, that was the threshold that they decided they needed to do something. But they didn't need to send everyone home. Here's the percent positive numbers with the same 3 arrows, and you see percent positive was pretty high. It got up to around 10%, and there was a day where it was above 20%. So 200 tests, they must have run 1,000 tests that day, if my calculations are right. No, actually 500 tests that day, right? No, 1,000. I'm doing it right. When you add up these numbers, this is a lot of tests and a lot of students. 7% of the student body has tested positive. But also notice this is similar to Notre Dame's numbers. I just didn't catch it because Notre Dame's numbers were lower because they have lower enrollments. Maybe this is some kind of constant. 7% of the student body gets infected and then cases go down. It's a hypothesis, needs to be tested. So Jared and Jean both noticed a similar thing when they started to look at data like this. The earlier pauses tend to result in better outcomes. And so you do have the evidence for this when you look at these ones in red that Jared put together and Jean looked at the same things. So Jared put together the data that you can see right here. Jean made a prediction based on it. So it's great to have these things together. Jean said that UW-Madison probably has a good outcome because they paused super early. On the other hand, University of Arizona had a late pause, and this would predict, of all the schools, maybe their outcome is worse. Or, that's the hypothesis, right? If their outcome's the same, then the pause, early or late, may not matter as much. We'll keep an eye on it. The good news is, whatever is causing it, cases are going down, and I want to leave you with that. So here's University of Arizona. Classes began, and they didn't shelter in place for their dorms until the 14th, just the other day, just a week ago. UC Boulder appears to be following a similar pattern, so we should keep an eye on both of those. And Arizona had a longer wait before they went on. I'm looking at my calendar to try to figure out what this is. Yeah, they had 3 weeks before they actually put on the pause. Does that have an effect? Why did they grow so much before they decided to before it turned around for them? Was it possible that they slowed it down and therefore delayed this peak? Let's look at all the data and let's try to figure out what happened. Here's another interesting one, UT Austin. Classes began 8/26. Here it is on the blue arrow, and you'll notice they went up and then they went down again. They didn't have any major lockdowns. In fact, they had a football game. Because if you notice, there's a big spike in testing on 9/11. Well, they had a football game that weekend, and to go into the football game, you had to have a negative test done. And so there was some repeating of tests, and there was some wondering about exactly what the positivity rate should be. But if you calculate it by what I think is a pretty standard calculation, there were 1,200 students tested, and more than 100 ended up testing positive. That worked out to a 5.8% positivity rate. My only thing about that is that seems higher than I would have expected for even a wide screening like that. Here's a county next door to UT Austin, which is done by C19 Pro, and they predict 1.87% currently infected for just that county, but also an upper range which is pretty close to the 5% number that they saw. So I would chalk this up for being that this could fit within the uncertainty, and it means that this low-risk population is more infected because we're enriched with students, right? They're more infected than expected, than perhaps the average. But it's an interesting question of when you do these wide screens, what do they get you? There's a number of schools that have done move-in student testing. They pre-screen the students, they force the students to take a test, or maybe they heavily recommend it, right? And at Virginia Tech, 9,000 students were tested, 21 of them were positive. That's a 0.23% positivity rate. And that's really low. It's below even the lower bounds of the estimates of Virginia on C19 Pro. My only thought about that is you test before a football game in a controlled sort of setting, you end up with 5% at Texas. Virginia Tech, they test everybody coming in, you end up with 0.2% positive. And the states are not that different. So I'm not sure what this means. University of Virginia had the same thing where they had a low positivity rate for the pre-arrival testing. And Keene noticed, my student, that the move-in testing didn't seem to change the outcomes for these. UC Berkeley, Keene went and found that, and they found that they had also reported a 0.3% move-in positivity. And that stayed low for them. Virginia Tech and UVA have both had cases go up, although not up enough to where they toggled, okay? They went up, and in fact, UVA has had a lot of cases lately, but that's because they've used wastewater testing to identify a dorm that they thought had an outbreak, and they tested everyone in that dorm. About a dozen students were positive in that, and that inflated their recent numbers. So it looks like UVA, the numbers are going up, but that's because of testing patterns changing. But this makes me question, it's a big effort to do this move-in positivity test, and it's probably not as standardized as the test that UT Austin did, or the other tests that we do, that are administered in controlled situations. How controlled are these tests? How real are these numbers? Are people not swabbing right, and that results in low numbers? Whatever it is, it doesn't look like the effort gained them any information that I can see, because we had 3 relatively different outcomes, and the move-in testing didn't seem to keep the schools from acting like the other schools, with the possible exception of UC Berkeley being really low still. One of the other questions, what do mask mandates do? I had a friend who pointed out that mask mandates were implemented relatively late in Iowa. Maybe University of Iowa has a bigger outbreak than others. Well, this is a cumulative test graph, but it shows, the yellow line shows what happened after University of Iowa classes started in the University of Iowa's county. And you see they went up, but then they stopped going up. You see a similar kind of pattern. The big line that you see, Polk, is where Des Moines is, and so that's probably a bigger, more urban kind of county. And what's interesting is you see a little spike there at the same time, but the rate of that going up is pretty constant for the cases. So it doesn't look like the late mask mandate resulted in University of Iowa having a different experience than everyone else. They look like the same. I've got to talk about my alma mater, University of Florida. They started August 31st, and cases have gone up. Are they still going up or not? It depends, and actually a few more tests have come in pushing those last couple of orange bars up a little bit. So you can make an argument that it's either plateauing or it could be slowly going up. It's not quickly going up. So let's look at our rival, Florida State University. They started a week earlier. Their county dashboard, with the caveat their county has a lot more things going on. They're in a capital city, and so they have a lot more residents and things like that. Still, you see the same pattern, and then it comes down. So I'm hoping that University of Florida will follow Florida State's pattern in this case. They probably will, because they seem to be pretty on the ball with their protocols. And I've got to talk about Bama if we're going to talk about the SEC. Here's Bama's. They started, and I can't find any school dashboard. All I can find is the county data, and the county data looks the same as before. You might have a slow simmering spread, but I don't really think that there's evidence for that. I think there's evidence for a little bump when the students came back, but not much in Bama. University of Georgia. Let's move on to the other Florida rival, because they are collecting cases. You see that on the bottom, where it looks like it's peaked and then come back down. But here's an important caveat. They're also reporting wastewater data. Now, the wastewater data is above, and I have the school start marked with the blue arrow. And if you look at that, after school started, both wastewater and school cases went up. The school cases went down more than the wastewater. I don't know what this means yet. Wastewater is not going up, but it's not going down either. Wastewater PCR is possibly sensitive enough to detect the virus still being put out by people after it's been defeated in a way. But I will note that earlier, when you had the statewide peak of cases that happened in July and August, the wastewater detected similar high levels when you had much fewer students in the putting stuff into the wastewater, and it went down before cases went down before. So I would say keep an eye on the wastewater. I'm glad that they're doing this, and every week they're going to be making it positive. It's possible that these cases going down are due to underreporting or under-testing or students finding a way to get around the test. Imagine that. The wastewater will tell what's still there. But realize also the wastewater data has its own drawbacks. Wastewater data tells a nicer story, although still a few drawbacks to it, at Arizona State. They started August 20th. And so you see that this wastewater is broken out by weeks. It has the same scale as before, by the way. They just aren't showing you the scatter. Whatever. I can look at the different areas. The University of the Arizona State University is in Area 2, which is shown in pink. And look at this. Classes started, and wastewater had a lot of COVID in it, but then it went down, and it's actually below quantifiable level for the recent thing. That's really good. But the other thing is, look over. Area 6 is close to campus, and I'm not sure, without knowing about it, how much of campus is on unofficially includes residents of Area 6. In Area 6, the wastewater went way up. So I had a student who found out something about this. They found that the Greek Leadership Village, 27 Greek chapters, is on the road that divides Area 2 from Area 6. In other words, at least half the frats are probably in Area 6. Probably a lot of off-campus students that are not controlled by protocols like the on-campus students are. And look at that wastewater go up. So let's keep an eye on that. The other thing is they've reported cases too. And if you zoom in on the cases for the zip code that has the university, you see there is a bump of cases, but it went back down. I don't quite understand this data because it looks a little bit weird to me. But I can say going up, going down, looks like the other cases. So with my own weirdnesses, I don't think that gets in the way of this data telling the same story as the other ones. So off-campus students, we see what's going on because we're looking at your wastewater. It looks like most universities are in a fragile stability. And this fragile stability can be wrecked by people who don't care about the protocols. But if people follow the protocols, the schools are being able to have lots of success with lots of different protocols. So that's the story I want to say. I collected a lot more data. I'm going to put this has been long enough already. This is kind of the general interest one, and I'm going to just talk through the data I collected for people who are interested in the other schools.